The startling revelations that Israeli officials have put forward so far include the discovery of a mosaic depicting Deborah and Yael, a 40-meter-long segment of a Hasmonean aqueduct that was used to bring water from the Solomon's pools to the Temple Mount, reconstruction of the Third Temple, the tradition of a red heifer, and a special crop of priests to oversee the sacrifices that will be offered on the temple. These are terrifying revelations of ancient prophecies pointing to several disturbing things, the most of which is the manifestation of the Antichrist. And in a moment, I will bring you more details on these as the video unfolds. Stick around. Israel is the origin of other religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all Abrahamic faiths that trace their roots to the prophet Abraham, who lived in Canaan, which later became Israel. When God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Israel as an everlasting inheritance, it led to three major religious factions you have today. Interestingly, these factions all acknowledge Abraham as a prophet and a patriarch, and revere Jerusalem as a holy city where many historical events occurred. Because of this, the Jews have laid claim on Israel, and rightly so. But this has caused the ongoing rift that has caused large-scale destruction of lives and properties. Also, some prominent archaeological structures have been revealed in Israel, and these have further strengthened the Jewish claim on Israel. These are the Temple Mount. Haram al-Sharif is the site of the first and second temples, the holiest places in Judaism, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third most sacred sites. The Western Wall is the remnant of a massive retaining wall for the Second Temple and the most sacred site for Jewish prayer and pilgrimage. The Arch of Titus depicts the Roman victory procession after the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile of the Jews in the 1st century CE. Jerusalem stands as a city of unparalleled significance among the three Abrahamic religions because of many reasons. First, Abraham was tested by God to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah, which later became the site of the Jewish temples and the Islamic Dome of the Rock. Second, King David established the Jewish monarchy, and his son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, which housed the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments. Third, in Jerusalem, Jesus Christ preached, performed miracles, was crucified and resurrected, and was where the early church began. Finally, Muslims believe that it's here that Muhammad ascended to heaven and received the revelation of the Quran, and where the first Qibla, direction of prayer, was oriented. The starting revelations that Israeli officials have put forward so far are troubling yet raise curiosity about their significance. These revelations are part of Israel's efforts to assert its historical and religious claims to the land of Israel, especially in the face of the Palestinian challenge. Israel views the archaeological findings as evidence of its ancient and continuous presence in the region and as a justification for its sovereignty and security interests, the reason why they won't allow the Gaza Strip in the hands of opposition. The ongoing Israel-Hamas war, which began on the 7th of October 2023, is the latest and most violent episode of the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is rooted in the disputed ownership of the land of Palestine. The war has been driven by various factors, such as the political and economic crisis in Gaza, the failure of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the rise of extremism and nationalism on both sides, the influence of external actors with their agendas, and the escalation of violence and provocation by both sides. The war has also been influenced by the religious and ideological dimensions of the conflict, such as the competing claims to Jerusalem and other holy sites, the differing interpretations of the scriptures and history, and the diverse aspirations of the Jewish and Muslim communities. Jerusalem is a city of great historical, religious, and political significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It is also a city of deep divisions and conflicts, as different groups claim rights and sovereignty over its holy sites and neighborhoods. The city is divided into two main sections: West Jerusalem, which is predominantly Jewish and under Israeli control, and East Jerusalem, which is mainly Arab and was occupied by Israel in 1967. East Jerusalem includes the Old City, where the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are located. Israel considers the whole of Jerusalem as its eternal and undivided capital, but this is not recognized by most of the international community, which regards East Jerusalem as occupied territory and the future capital of a Palestinian state. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel and the center of their religious and national identity. They don't only believe that the Messiah will come and rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem, and that the ingathering of the exiles will take place there, but they are also ready to take on the rebuilding themselves. The third temple is a hypothetical rebuilt temple in Jerusalem that would succeed the first and second temples, destroyed by the Babylonians and the Romans respectively. The temple was the center of Jewish worship and sacrifice, where God's presence dwelled among His people. Some Jewish groups, such as the Temple Institute and the Temple Mount Faithful, have been preparing to construct the third temple by making utensils, vessels, and garments, and studying the temple service's laws and rituals. One of the requirements for the temple service is the ashes of a red heifer, a rare cow that is entirely red and without any blemish or defect. The red heifer was slaughtered and burned outside the camp, and its ashes were mixed with water to purify those who became impure by contact with a corpse. The Temple Institute claims to have found several red heifers that meet the biblical criteria and plans to use them to purify the priests and the Temple Mount. Still, this plan appears to be sinister, which is why you should be worried. The temple project has also led them to embark on the training of a particular group of priests, known as the Kohanim. The training of this Kohanim is a crucial preparation for the third temple, as only the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, can perform the temple service. The Temple Institute has established a school to train priests in the laws and practices of the temple, such as the offering of sacrifices, the lighting of the menorah, and the blessing of the people. The school also teaches the priests how to avoid ritual impurity and maintain the sanctity of the temple. The priest training is based on sources of Jewish tradition, such as the Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Midrash. The construction of the new altar is another step towards realizing the third temple, as the altar was where the sacrifices were offered to God. The Temple Institute has built a full-scale model of the altar, made of metal and stone, that can be disassembled and reassembled quickly. The altar is 5 meters high, 16 meters long, and 16 meters wide, with 4 horns, one at each corner. The altar also has a ramp for the priests to ascend, and a drainage system for the blood of the sacrifices. The Temple Institute claims that the altar is fit for use and can be operational at little more than a moment's notice. Being part of the reasons for the scruffle, the Jews want to reclaim the Temple Mount because they believe it is the holiest place in Judaism, where God chose to rest His name and where the 2 temples stood. They also believe that the Temple Mount is the site of many biblical events, such as the binding of Isaac, the vision of Jacob, and the anointing of King David. However, they face many political and religious challenges from the Muslims, who also consider the Temple Mount as the third holiest site in Islam, where Muhammad ascended to heaven and received the revelation of the Quran. The Temple Mount is currently under the administration of the Islamic Waqf, a Jordanian-funded trust that oversees the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Waqf does not allow any non-Muslim prayer or worship on the Temple Mount, and any attempt by Jews to enter or pray there is met with resistance and hostility. The status quo of the Temple Mount is a source of tension and conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as the wider Muslim world, and any change or perceived threat to it can have serious repercussions. Apart from the religious and political strife, the Jews also face other challenges in rebuilding the Third Temple. These include the legal and logistical obstacles from the international community and the United Nations, which have declared the Temple Mount a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a potential flashpoint for violence. The financial and material resources needed to fund, equip, and sustain the massive construction project, which requires thousands of workers, engineers, architects, artisans, and donors. The spiritual and moral motivation to fulfill God's commandment to rebuild His house on His chosen site involves overcoming fear, doubt, corruption, compromise, and idolatry. However, this act of rebuilding isn't just about the superficial layer as you'd think it to be. There are biblical connotations. We are talking about ancient prophecies that foretold a time where, during the Messianic era, the Antichrist would manifest to convince world powers to support the rebuilding work. He will take all the credit for himself. The role of the Antichrist is to deceive many people into following him and worshiping him at the rebuilt temple. He will claim to be God's representative on earth and demand allegiance from all nations. He will also set up an image of himself in the temple and demand that everyone bow down to it or face death. The role of Israel will be to resist the Antichrist's tyranny and lead God's people in a final battle against him at Armageddon. God's angels will protect Israel from his attacks until they reach Jerusalem. There, they will join forces with other nations who have repented their sins and accepted Jesus as their Messiah. So far, you've seen the historical background of the destruction and rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Romans. You've seen the theological significance of the temple and the wall for the Jewish faith and identity and their connection to God's covenant and presence. You've witnessed the current efforts and challenges of some Jewish groups to rebuild the Third Temple and the wall, and the political and religious opposition they face from the Muslims and the international community, as well as the end-time prophecies related to the Third Temple and the wall, and the role of the Antichrist, Israel, and Christ in the final events of history. But there's one more lesson to grapple with. There's never been a time when rebuilding the temple was done without opposition. The story of Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 1-7 is an inspiring example of faithfulness, courage, leadership, vision, prayer, action, cooperation, and celebration in rebuilding the wall. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes of Persia, who heard about the sad condition of Jerusalem after its destruction by Babylonians in 586 BC. He faced many challenges along his journey. He had to travel through hostile territories. He had to deal with opposition from some Jews who did not want him to go. He had to overcome personal doubts about his ability. He had to persuade others to join him in his mission. He had to manage resources wisely. He had to supervise workers diligently. He had to protect himself from enemies. He had to balance work with worship. He completed his mission successfully. He rebuilt Jerusalem's walls in 52 days despite all odds. He restored Jerusalem's gates in 12 days despite all obstacles. He celebrated Jerusalem's completion with joy despite all hardships. He left a legacy that lasted for generations. Nehemiah was remembered as one of Israel's most significant leaders who restored their land after exile. Nehemiah was honored as one of God's faithful servants who obeyed his word after hearing it. Nehemiah was prophesied as one of Christ's witnesses who prepared for his coming after seeing it. Brethren, I'll end by asking you to reflect on these things and prepare for what might come sooner than expected on the world. Thanks for watching, and do have a pleasant time till we meet again.